being in Alaska meant that you had to be tough. You had to be strong. Back then, you lived without electricity. I mean, I literally lived in a house without electricity or running water. My son was 11 years old before he ever lived in a place that had running water. You know, so you go out and you work all day at the Economic Development Center being this director in this fancy office, and then you come home and you split wood and you stoke the fire and you carry water. You go down to the spring or you go down to the laundromat and you fill up your jugs of water and bring it home, and you cook, you heat your water on the stove for washing dishes. I mean, that's a lot of work to do in the evening. And and at that point I was a single parent, that's a lot. Mm-hmm. And so we were tough, and we didn't have any choice. We had to be tough. But what I believe, Dave, is I truly believe there's a little Alaska in each of us. I believe very strongly that every one of us has that little piece of toughness in our soul, in our heart, in our mind, and we can do it. We just have to, put on our gloves and do it.
That was Cindy Adams. Cindy is a very, very rare breed, a serial social entrepreneur who has had probably more of an impact on your organization than you've realized. Hers is a story about ingenuity, grit, a deep sense of purpose, and a spirit that simply won't let up. This is the first segment of at least 2, maybe 3 of my conversation with Cindy. Stay tuned for more. Over 660,000 square miles, Alaska is over 1/5 the size of the lower 48 states. The distance from its southernmost town, Adak, to its northernmost, Utqiagvik, say that several times fast, is nearly 1,500 miles. In her early days in Alaska, Cindy's work helping small native communities, what Cindy calls the villages, took her to every corner of our vast 49th state.
Sometimes I would be in the air I'd be in the air for 4 or 5 hours flying just to another village.
And according to Cindy, it wasn't advisable to make firm plans.
And a lot of these villages, Dave, if you went into them, it was hard to get out. Mm-hmm. Like when I flew into Unalaska in the Aleutian Islands, I was supposed to be there 2 days teaching a workshop, but I was there 5 days because once a storm comes in the Aleutians, you don't go anywhere.
If you look at a map of Alaska and you isolate the Aleutian Islands, you see that they are a 1,000-mile-long chain of 145 islands. With fewer than 3,000 natives, this too was a part of Cindy's territory.
And I would fly out to villages all over the state and sleep on the gym floor in my sleeping bag and get up the next morning and teach 12 people how to raise money.
I was curious, as I always am, what inspires a person like Cindy to work for the common good. And so I asked her about the origins of her commitment to the environment and helping others do good things. I grew up in the Roman Catholic tradition, and Cindy's answer reminded me of St. Francis of Assisi's suggestion: preach the gospel at all times. When necessary, use words.
I was raised on a farm in Minnesota, and my parents were interesting people. My dad was from Appalachia, and my mother grew up in the country in Minnesota. And they both had a very strong belief in protecting the earth. But I would have said that to them, they would have scratched their heads and said, "Huh? I don't know what you're talking about. Go get out there and pick those peas."
Right.
It wouldn't have been. They would never have described themselves as conservationists or environmentalists or anything like that.
Cindy Adams is at heart a storyteller. And she told a story to illustrate the ethic that she grew up with.
My dad was a very poor farmer, but we were farmers. And he was also a plumber. He was a very bad plumber. But anyway, nonetheless, he tried. He had a little plumbing business, but we had this farm. And so he decided that the cows in the pasture had to come a long way up to the barn to get water when they were thirsty, which was cutting down on the time when they were grazing. And so he figured that if he dug a hole in the back of the pasture, which was next to a swamp, it would fill up with water and they could drink there. And it worked. He got a backhoe and he dug a hole and he created a pond. And then the next spring, he comes into the house, and this is very typical. He sits down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and talking to my mom, and he says, well, there's some ducks landing down there on that pond I built, and yeah, it looks like they're going to nest. And Mother goes, uh-huh. So I'm thinking I better fence it off so the cows can't get in there and bother those ducks. And Mother's like, yeah, I think that's probably a good idea. So, it was that kind of thing that happened to us all the time. The Christmas tree farm he started, but then the birds nested in it, and well, we can't cut them.
Right.
There's many examples like that. And so when I was young, that was what I was surrounded with. Poor business management, as well as this strong belief and desire to protect the earth and the wildlife.
Cindy had other experiences as a youngster that contributed to her being successful as a social entrepreneur, including her time as a member of the Saddle Club. In this story, we see a young Cindy do something that many of us are hesitant to do: make the ask.
When I was really, really young, I was probably 13 or so, I belonged to a saddle club. Do you know what a saddle club is? So it's a horseback riding club. And I really wanted to belong to the club, but I couldn't ride my horse in the parades or do all the little things they did with their horses because I was too young yet. They wouldn't let me. But of course I rode horse all the time. So I wanted to do it, but I couldn't. But every time I went to a club meeting, and I went to them all, they were always talking about the land, that they needed the land that they now rented to be donated to them. But this man in town who owned the land, they didn't think he'd give it to them. And I kept thinking, well, why don't they ask him?
Ask him.
So one day I was walking home I wasn't home from school. I was walking to my grandma's house from school, and I passed this man's house, and he was sitting on the stoop of the house. So I just went up and asked him. I said, could you, I belong to my name's Cindy Pig. My last name was Pig, Dave.
P-I-G, Pig?
2 G's.
2 G's.
Yeah. So, my whole life I grew up laughing.
I've never heard that last name.
I haven't. My whole family, every night at dinner, we tell pig stories. What happened to us. I mean, our family laughed a lot. We were very poor, by the way, but we laughed a lot. Anyway, I just went up to Mr. Sikora and I said, I belong to the Saddle Club and they won't let me ride. And he talked to me about that a little bit and went back and forth. I mean, I had never met him. And we went back and forth, talked a little bit about the Saddle Club. And I said, every time I go to a meeting, they always talk about asking you to donate this land, but everybody's afraid to ask you. And he said, well, I do that. I said, oh, good. I was like, oh, good, thanks, and I left. And then the next club meeting, I didn't even call anybody or tell them or anything. The next club meeting was weeks away. And I went to it and I said, oh, I talked to Mr. Sikora and he said he'd donate the land if you want it. And and it was just so easy. So then after that happened, after I had that experience, I just never understood why people wouldn't just ask.
If you're like me, you find it easy to see how these early experiences set the stage for Cindy's life as a purpose-inspired professional.
So when I went off to college in 1969, of course, I got immediately involved in the environmental movement, the conservation movement, and as well as marching, in the streets to stop the war in Vietnam and marching to protect civil rights, many, many miles from Martin Luther King, but still in step. And so my life has been purpose driven. If you understand what I'm saying,
Sure.
is that it was just like that.
In my next segment with Cindy Adams, we'll talk more about how her early life shaped her purpose work.
One thing I learned from my parents, and hands down, all of my siblings learned this, is that you just do it. And there's no limitations.
Listen for that next segment coming soon. Thank you for listening, and as always, stay safe and be well.